Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Cybersecurity, What the Executive Needs to Know. My name is Mike Hoffner. I'm Managing Partner at McConley & Asbury and the Partner in charge of SOC Services. While I'm an audit guy at heart, I spend a lot of my time focused on firm administration, and looking forward to talking about this topic today, as it's certainly one that is important to us as a firm, and I know important to those of you on the call.
Good afternoon. This is Dave Hammarberg, principal at McConley & Asbury. Been here a little over 20 years, so been here for a while. Expert in forensic examinations, lead that area, as well as participate in the SOC leadership at the firm. Cybersecurity is sort of a passion for me. I'm a CISSP as well as a CPA. Help internally as well as external clients with their cybersecurity stance. And been doing that for quite a while. So I love what I do, and hopefully we can teach you guys something new throughout this webinar.
So before we get started on the topic, just wanted for those that aren't as familiar with McConley & Asbury to give a real brief overview of the firm. We are a team of individuals serving out of 3 offices, serving the Mid-Atlantic region, primarily focused on greater central Pennsylvania. We provide full service accounting and tax services, as well as have a really deeply experienced group of individuals in some really core specialty consulting areas and some specialty industries. So some information on your screen there, and would love the opportunity to ask you to go check out our website if you don't know much about us, see what else we do. And if there's an opportunity for the firm to come alongside you, we certainly would enjoy that and enjoy that conversation. So before we get started on today's content, I just want to mention, if you have questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the built-in questions function on the webinar control panel, and we will do our best to answer them either during or after the webinar. If we do not have time on the tail end of the webinar, we will try and answer them in a direct manner to those who ask. So please keep that in mind and ask the questions as they come up while we speak. There will also be 3 polling questions throughout the program. Be sure to answer those polling questions if you're looking to obtain CPE credit, and you do need to answer all 3 of the questions in order to receive that CPE credit. So with that, I want to just give a brief overview of what we're going to talk about over the next hour. As a reminder, when we put the initial advertising and placeholders out for this session, we tried to be as clear as possible that this was very much an entry-level discussion for the executive. It is not geared towards the IT or cybersecurity professional. It's geared towards the individual who is in a responsible position in an organization that needs to understand the risk that is faced through cyber threats and cybersecurity. And really needs to understand the risk and what to look for and what to ask about, but may not necessarily be the individual that is best equipped or at all equipped to go solve or create solutions to the threats and risks out there. So we do intend to keep this very high level. It is geared towards being an introductory high level overview, really focusing on a few key points. First is an introduction to cybersecurity and some of the key terms that we'll be using. It's certainly not going to be an exhaustive list of the key terms, but want to make sure some of those key items are understood, and that things that are commonly used in language that those who don't deal with it every day might not understand exactly what it means. We want to bring some context to those terms. We want to give a rundown of what we see as the most common threats and attacks that are seen, both throughout our client base and throughout studies and things that we see and read. And then we'll spend some time at the end talking about the best steps to reduce the risk. And we're going to focus on information technology and infrastructure. We're going to focus heavily on employee education and training and testing. And then we'll talk real briefly about how you might transfer some of the risk that you experience. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave to get us started on some conversation around why you should care about cybersecurity.
Yeah, why should you care? And I think the quick answer to that is every organization is going to be affected by some kind of security incident. And the more we prepare, less impact that's going to have on your organization. So you know, the old thing of it's not going to affect me because I'm too small or I don't have enough valuable information. There's really no such thing these days. I mean, any organization can be hurt by a cybersecurity issue, unless, of course, you're that lawn care business that doesn't have a computer and all they do is mow lawns, right? So we'll get into a slide in a cartoon of, how do we completely be secure? Well, you turn everything off, but that's usually not the case for most organizations and probably most individuals on this call. So just take a few minutes and jot down what your thoughts are on percentages for each one of these. Now, the bottom two aren't percentages, but for the first four there, just jot down what you think those are. You might be surprised one way or the other. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that.
Fantastic. And Dave, your lawn care comment has me thinking about the first time that I presented this topic. Well, folks are thinking about these percentages and what they think the answers are. First time I presented this topic was to a group of executives, and we actually, the host location for the presentation, we're actually at the Witness Farm in Lancaster. So we were on an Amish farm with no electricity talking about cybersecurity. When we talked about how you prevent the risk is basically shut everything off, we looked around and realized they were already there.
Yeah, so there are some organizations that are not hurt by cybersecurity incidents, but by far that is not the case for most. So jumping into their percentage of cyber attacks targeting small businesses, 28%. You might think that's low, but cyber attack could be just a phishing attempt. So there's different degrees of cyber attacks, et cetera. And most of these numbers come from the 2020 Verizon security study that was put out there, if you're wondering. Percentage of breaches involving phishing, 22%. Now, that doesn't mean that only 22% of small businesses received a phish. That means 22% of the business clicked on it and it caused a breach. Didn't cause an incident, it caused a breach. That means data was vendor data, customer data, employee data was taken outside the organization, et cetera. Percentage of breaches that were financially motivated, 86%. Not a whole lot of people do work for nothing, right?
Shocker, the bad guys are after money. That doesn't surprise anybody.
Exactly. Why do we have variants and variants of ransomware? Because people are making millions and millions of dollars. It's worth it to put in the effort. So you got 86% there. I imagine the difference there is motivated employees that want revenge or something in regards to that. Have some kind of grudge about against somebody. Would you agree with that, Mike?
I would.
Percentage of breaches using actual user credentials, 37%. So those could be user credentials that attacker got from a phish. That they sent an email, hey, log into your Facebook account before the account's deleted, or something like that. Or it could be an employee just causing the breach by entering the username and password. So
37% are not crafty hackers like Dave just cracking your passcode or your password. 37% are they actually got your legitimate login information and used it to get into a system.
That's correct. Yep. And the funny thing is, well, how do you prevent something like that from happening? Right. And we'll get into dual factor authentication. Logging is a big thing. Should your employees be logging in at 2 a.m. in the morning? Sure. We have some employees at McConnelly Asbury that do work crazy hours like that. But for the most part, there's usually a rhythm to people's work hours. And if I see Mike working at 2 a.m. in the morning, might not be an issue. But if I see, John Doe over there working at 2 a.m. in the morning, I know they'd never work then. So, you gotta, figure out your organization, et cetera. Top threat action varieties and incidents, denial of service attack. We'll get into a little bit of what that is, but that's pretty much doing something against an application website that is going to prevent others from using it. Not necessarily getting data out of it, but making it so busy or getting that CPU up so high that it no longer functions properly. And therefore, preventing users from buying your product or, contacting you, et cetera. Top threat action variety and breaches, phishing. Obviously phishing is a huge deal. We're going to get into what you should be doing with phishing. But it's funny. I had an employee tell me one time that, the phishing attacks we do a lot of phishing attacks against employees here. And I had an employee once tell me that, it was too good. They don't know that much information about me. But boy, you can find a lot of information about somebody between their Facebook page, their LinkedIn page, and just searching their name on Google. You can find hobbies, interests, and
you're giving away all our content for later in the program.
That's true. All right, I'm done. I'm going on to the next slide.
So point being, you should care because there are a lot of threats and a lot of things to be concerned about. And there's a lot more stats we could put up there about how things can go wrong. But point being, everybody is subject to this kind of risk, and you should care about what the exposure is.
Correct. And some of this may seem overwhelming to you, especially if you're executive and you're not in the weeds and you don't know exactly what your organization is doing. So you got to start somewhere. And a lot of times clients will come to me and say, where do we start? And a lot of larger clients will have frameworks, et cetera. We'll suggest a framework or two, but you got to start somewhere and, just keep being more and more proactive.
Yep.
There's
that's what we're here for today.
Correct.
To talk about where to start.
And there's never an end, right? Once you're done through this part, the hackers are always changing. The attacks ways are always changing. The threats are always changing. It's just a continual evolution. But I see Mike is urging me on to the next slide. So here's a pretty slide. One of the two things on here that I'd like to point out is 1.48 billion lost just to phishing. It's a huge amount, and that is really a training awareness issue for employees. If you can get that under control, your risk goes down a ton. And we'll see in slides coming forth, ransomware, all sorts of bad things happen through phishing. People sending, checks out, all sorts of different things. And then the last one there, I'm going to skip the online dating scams.
I was looking forward to that conversation.
I'm not sure how 1 billion a year from Americans is stolen from dating scams, but it hasn't been an interest for me. But anyway, we'll keep going. 60% of small businesses that suffer a cyber attack fail. In other words, if you have an organization and you have a phishing scheme or ransomware is huge, right? And your organization ends up paying that ransom, or going back to backup, you lose a week or two. A lot of organizations can't survive that downtime, or that cost for experts to come in, the issues with the breach notification, the hurt on just your reputation. There's a lot of things there that go into that 60% of small business fail. Email and phone are top targets for cyber criminals. Obviously, through phishing. I got a great text a couple of days ago from a local bank. Looked awesome. Of course, I don't have an account there, but it asked me to sign in and change my username and password. It was fantastic. Other than, a bank's not going to do that, and I didn't have an account. The one on the right there, current and past employees cause more than half of the attacks on companies. That goes back to that previous slide where, it's a lot of attacks are used by the credentials that we give out. We're trusting employees, and that attack there, you don't have to have someone that, you can have someone that unknowingly does something that causes that attack to happen. So again, it goes back to security awareness training. Ransomware accounts for just over half of the global data breaches. Ransomware, I feel like everyone has heard ransomware. We've preached about it. But again, until you are actually phishing your employees, you don't know who's going to click on. You have to figure out who your weakest link is and not get rid of them, but provide more training. I mean, it's all about lifting that person up. I mean, we talk about strength-based companies and increasing people's strength. Well, if someone's got a weakness in phishing, you have to increase that situation there and the awareness for that employee. And here at McConnell Asbury, we sort of have consequences for phishing fails. And there's a 50%, 50-50, people are like, that's, not the right way to deal with it, et cetera. But there's got to be some teeth behind that phishing. Anyway, I'm moving on.
So Dave has, I'm going to call you out a little bit, Dave. You've done a masterful job of giving away about a third of our future slides already, which is wonderful. So you're going to hear a little bit of repetition as we go on. Dave already gave away my favorite cartoon of the, well, there's a couple other ones coming up. But reality is, when we talk about eliminating the risk, and as an executive, the goal is to eliminate risk. And where we can eliminate risk, we figure out how to mitigate and transfer it. But if we can eliminate risk, we always feel better, right? But reality is, when we're talking about pretty much any kind of risk, it's hard to eliminate, but it is virtually impossible to eliminate risk around the things we're talking about today. So I did find it entertaining. Our devices are now 100% secure. The only way that that can be true is that they're turned off and you are disconnected, which is not the way business is conducted. It's not the way we can really function. And so again, we're going to talk about some mechanisms to mitigate and reduce risk, but it is impossible to eliminate that risk in your organization. So before we do that, we want to talk about some of those basic terms, as we mentioned, and just to draw some key distinctions. And I said earlier, and I'll say again, this list of key terms is not even remotely all-inclusive. If you were to do some basic research on key terms around cyber risk and cybersecurity, you would find list upon list that gets into some real significant detail. Again, our goal today is to keep it at that 30,000 foot level, to speak to the executive and give the key things that you should be considering and thinking of. So we're just going to go through a few high-level points of awareness. One is the term and the difference between cyber risk and IT risk. And often those are used interchangeably, but they're very different. And we want to draw that line very clearly as we talk about the rest of our presentation today. Cyber risk is the potential of loss or harm related to technical infrastructure or the use of technology. It is one aspect of risk among many that we need to think about, but it is that specific potential for loss or harm that would be driven by a technical matter or technology matter or a breach, or as Dave talked about, and we'll get into that a little bit more. The difference between that and IT risk, and I'm going to skip the cybersecurity piece for a moment, IT risk is far more encompassing. So when we talk about our IT risk as an organization, that includes things like hardware issues, capacity issues. We have issues with software becoming out of date. We have that global idea of what an IT department manages, and often we just sort of lump cyber risk and cyber security and integrity into that, and they couldn't be more different. And we'll talk a little bit more about the people who manage these things and the processes of managing these things. But I point out that difference because if you feel like you have a great handle in your organization on IT risk, I would challenge you to step back and think, does that mean I also have a great handle on cyber risk? And to think about the differences between the two. Cybersecurity, as we're really focused on today, cybersecurity is really those processes and techniques and the things you do to protect the sensitive data in your systems from the cyber attacks that we're going to be talking about as things go on. So just want to point out those three things and really key in on that idea that cyber risk and IT risk are very different, and you as an executive need to be thinking about them in different contexts.
A couple more key terms here, incident and breach. One thing you got to remember, a breach is always going to be an incident, but an incident is not necessarily going to be a breach. An incident could be anything that compromises the integrity or confidentiality or availability of an information asset. An organization should have an incident response plan to determine what the outcome of that incident is. That should be documented. There should be certain people that are involved, and it should be very methodical. A breach is an incident, but it is also a confirmed disclosure of data to an unauthorized party. Sometimes I have trouble talking. I won't get into why. I bit my tongue about 2 days ago, and man,
I won't get into why, but let me tell you.
Yeah, I thought, I can't say that because they're going to think I'm drunk. But I just bit my tongue. So we'll move on. The reportable, a reportable incident is when a breach involves a customer, vendor, or private data. And I guess I'm getting quite the reaction here about the drunk statement. So I assume I should not have mentioned that, huh, Mike? Anyway, we'll go further through the control, terms here. Control. So, Mike, there's various controls, correct?
Correct.
So, I think in this instant, we're really talking about preventive and detective controls. There's also corrective controls, but from a security standpoint, and in this presentation, I think we're talking about preventive and detective. Preventive, we don't have an issue. Detective, we had an incident and we detected it. You could think of it almost as if you have an intrusion detection system or intrusion prevention system, the intrusion prevention system is going to prevent something from coming in. The intrusion detection system doesn't do anything other than alert you. So that is probably more information than
it's good information
at this level. But the DDoS, distributed denial of service attack, again, we went through, that's something that is going to prevent normal users or people we want using something from actually being able to use it. Social engineering, we'll talk about this more in detail, but it's really using that human element. How do I convince Mike to do something that he normally would not do? How do I make that seem normal? Or do I threaten him to say, hey, this is going to happen if you don't do it? I've seen both ways work wonderfully. But there's definitely master attackers out there in social engineering.
Dave, nobody uses psychological manipulation tricks like you do.
I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not.
With that, let's move to our first polling question, which is very simple. So we're just going to give you about 30 seconds to answer this. And the question is, has your organization been a victim of a cyber attack at any point during 2020? Yes, no, or I have no idea. And as a reminder, in order to get CPE for this session, you do need to answer all three of these. So hopefully this one is a pretty straightforward one to think through. And so as you finish answering that up, Dave, has our organization been the victim of a cyber attack at any point during 2020?
We are continually under cyber attack, whether those are phishing or all sorts of different ways. And we're continually putting in software, hardware, training to mitigate those issues.
Yeah.
Prevent those issues.
So let's take a look at what the composite answers were. So the answers are 21% yes, 40% no, and 39% say I have no idea. So, and I'm just going to take a second on these results because I would say some of it might depend on how you read the question. And part of why I asked Dave the question I asked while you were answering this is to be very intentional that if we were answering this the way that Dave answered it, which is, have you been the victim of a cyber attack? Not have you experienced loss from a cyber attack? Have you been a victim? I would say that every single participant on our webinar today should have answered yes, because the likelihood is you don't know about a lot of the ones that are happening, whether it's pinging from outside to try and find an open port, or phishing attacks that your employees delete because they're good, they're smart. But I think reality is it's safe to say that a very, very high percentage of your organizations have been the victim of a cyber attack. You just have not experienced loss because you've had good processes, controls, or people. And for those that say they have no idea, we'll talk a little bit more about how you can get a better idea of that in your organization. And particularly for the executive, what kind of questions should you be asking? So thank you for answering that. I was kind of hoping the answer would be 100% yes, because I think statistics would say it's pretty close to that. But we'll move on from that.
Ransomware, we've been hearing this for, I bet you, a decade now. And you have to wonder, why are we still talking about this? And again, I brought this up earlier. It's because, those average ransom payment, $111,000, you know, you can send out a lot of phishing emails. And if you strike $111,000 ransomware, that's fantastic. As well as you can buy ransomware kits online to do at home. Now, I wouldn't suggest that because you're probably going to be
In jail.
But these kits it's not like someone is developing these ransomware, and they're coming out with new variants all the time. So, for the current security software, hardware, it's sometimes tough to keep up with that area. But what ransomware is it's, say Mike clicked on a attachment or a link in his email or a link on a website that will encrypt everything on his computer, as well as most of the time encrypt anything on his local drives. So if you have an H drive or any kind of network drive, that usually encrypts all of the data. So Word documents, Excel documents, all those things all of a sudden are going to have a different extension. And you'll probably get a pop-up that says, hey, you're lucky, you just got ransomware. Probably won't say you're lucky, and you probably won't feel lucky, but they will tell you, what they would like from you. You'll contact your attorney and you'll tell them what's going on, and you'll hope that your IT people have backups. I don't know how many organizations I go and say they have backups, but they don't check they have backups. They don't restore from them. And in this incident, it's really critical, because if you don't have backups, your only option, if you need the data to continue, which most organizations do, is pay that ransom.
So Dave, this idea where I have clicked on that email from UPS that says my shipment's on the way.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a difference in exposure in today's environment, where so many employees are working from home versus sitting with their laptop attached to a docking station at the office? Is there a difference in exposure, and should the executive be more concerned when people are in the office, or just as concerned when people are working from home? Is there a difference in how this flows?
Strictly from a ransomware standpoint, it's really, in my opinion, no different. When you have a remote user, you always have more risk. So I think from an executive standpoint, I would consider that more risk as a user from home. But from a ransomware standpoint, if Mike clicks on that link in the office, or when he's at home connected to the VPN, and that's key, is he's connected to the VPN, that is going to do the same thing. Now, take for instance, Mike was at home, he was not connected to the VPN or any other kind of secure tunnel into the office, that ransomware would be on his machine. Now, he brings...
just dumb enough to bring it to the office.
Exactly.
And into my docking station, that's a problem.
Correct. Yes. So, that's another training, security awareness training. When you have an issue at home or at a client, don't bring that computer back into our network. Let us scan it first. Let us, figure out what is going on there. But it's a huge issue whether you're in the office or out of the office.
That was valuable in today's world.
Correct. Yes. Yeah, we were lucky as an organization because of all of our remote work already, that we had a lot of policies and procedures in place. But a lot of organizations have really jumped onto the remote bandwagon. And whenever you jump on something quick, a lot of times the planning isn't there and the security isn't there. So I found a lot of organizations that are going back now to check that out. Because those organizations at the beginning were thinking, hey, this is going to be a 2-3 week thing. We're going to be back to normal. Now we're looking at next summer, depending on who you ask. Like I said, I think we were lucky as an organization, but ransomware generates over 25 million, not for you, obviously, for those attackers overseas mostly. I've never heard of them not locking your data. That would be a devastating thing to their business plan, because who's going to pay if 1 or 2 people don't get their data unlocked? So we do have some honorable criminals, I guess. Not everyone pays. Now these numbers are a little old. They're back from 2018, but 97% of U.S. companies refuse to pay. But again, if you go back to that last slide, the average ransom payment's still 111,000 if you do pay.
Yeah.
Most larger organizations are going to have backups, et cetera. But medium-sized, small organizations, they may not have backups. And is your backup safe from the ransomware? That's a great question. We do all sorts of different backups here at McConnelly and Asbury. Some are taken off-site, literally, so that they're not attached to the network. But then, a lot of backups are online, et cetera. So you really have to think outside the box on how that ransomware could, if ransomware attacks your backup, you're paying the ransom.
I found that statistic from City of Atlanta to be really sort of eye-opening, and this goes back a little ways, and it's a pretty well documented case study. So if you're interested, go read it. But just that idea that the hacker demanded a $51,000 ransom, 6 Bitcoin. And they refused, and because of the nature of, a city, municipal government, all the things that go around with that, $17 million plus to recover what could have been unlocked for $51,000. So just those are the things we got to think about. Sometimes it's just better to write the check and go from there.
What about that last point there? What's your thoughts on there?
We'll talk about that at the end, okay. Because we're going to talk a little bit about risk transfer, and if you have a cyber policy, the question of does it cover that payment of, in the case of City of Atlanta, $51,000, right? Does a cyber policy cover that? And I think my thought on that is it depends, and it all depends on how your policy is written and what you've done and what caused the breach. But largely, most policies, many policies do not cover what we're talking about here, but you need to read your policy.
I've got some comments on that, but I'll let you get to your slides first.
If we get there.
Something new. So another common cyber attack is phishing. We've mentioned this how many times already? You need to phish your employees. This day and age, it's not a mean thing to do. It's something that you need to do in order to gauge where you are and how you're going to train your employees. There's two software packages that I probably would recommend out there. One is KnowBe4. The other is Proofpoint, which used to be Wombat. Both fairly good products. They provide the ability to phish your employees, good reporting, as well as when those employees fail that phishing, they can take additional training. So they're signed up right away for training, and you can share that with, the IT person could share that with executive management. That goes a long way in getting what you need from a security standpoint. If you show your executive, hey, we've got 15 people, which represents 15% of the organization clicking on these phishing emails, we are very likely to have issues in the future. So anyway, it's a tool that can be used in various ways. So phishing, they're obviously trying for your passwords, credit card numbers, bank information, personal information. One thing is, we get a lot of phishing emails trying to get your credentials. Nowadays, and we'll get into this further in some slides, but dual factor authentication. If you're not using dual factor authentication as an organization, you are way behind. Every organization should be using dual factor authentication for all remote sessions. I'm not saying you need to use it on a laptop in the organization, but remotely, they should all be done. So your SSH connections, your Citrix connections, your VPN connections, Office 365 connections for sure, should all be dual factor. High volume of attacks. So if I'm an attacker, I could send out 5,000 emails, and all I need is one person to click on that phishing email to make my year.
And I think it's important to note, and I don't know if you were going to get into this and I'm jumping ahead, but I'm just getting back at you for that. It's not just sending out the spam emails when we talk about this idea of phishing and social engineering, trying to get personal information. Dave could very easily go on Facebook, create a new user account, and send out a quiz. And that quiz could, what do you want to do, Dave? What kind of salsa are you? And somehow when you go on Facebook and you enter your hometown, your high school mascot, your father's middle name, you answer all these questions, somehow that determines that you're, I don't know, spicy garden style salsa.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Right?
Yeah.
So we have to be more aware of this idea of social engineering and getting personal information. It's not just the emails that look bad. We are victims all the time because of things that look normal, and we just got to be careful.
Well, all that information you entered to find out you were that spicy salsa, is the same information that you're putting down for a bank account, secret questions. What was your first pet's name? What street did you live on as a child? Well, they needed all that to figure out you were a spicy salsa. Anyway,
continue.
Yeah, enough with spicy salsa. And I think we hit phishing quite a bit. Let me just see here. Obviously, everyone's seeing the FedEx shipment cannot be delivered. The biggest phishing issue I have is when employees are really busy. You have really stressed out employees. You have employees that are, you just doing a ton of stuff, and they fail when they have high stress. We had a penetration testing a couple of years ago, and we sent out an email from, I believe it was, I think it was from the IT director. It could have been from HR, I forget. But it pretty much said, hey, you need to do this before, it was Friday evening, 5 o'clock, do this before the weekend. And it didn't end so well. So, you really have to take a good stance at trying to fool the employees and seeing, because the attackers who are making millions are doing that. So again, you're worst off when you're busy, I think, is what I'm getting down to. Again, could be ransomware that you're downloading, could be a keylogger, could be a dormant code that's on your system for years. Not just via email, fraudulent websites. And there's definitely an uptick in phone and text messages, just like I said with that local bank. You're never going to get IRS texts. The IRS is not going to do that, but there's a lot of victims out there, and they're only going to stop when they stop making money, which probably not going to happen.
Truth.
Ransomware attack vendors. I thought this was an interesting slide. Threw it on there. The RDP compromise, which is remote desktop. I thought email phishing would be the highest way to get ransomware. And then software vulnerability and other. But again, email phishing. If you aren't doing anything, start with email phishing. It's a serious issue. Spear phishing. It's a targeted phishing attack. It really the individual knows who you are between LinkedIn, Facebook, and they're trying to attack you. So I know Mike's managing partner, and I'm going to attack him in a way that he's a managing partner. I know he has resources. I know he can sign off on things, etc. So I know who my target is, and I'm going to attack him. And we will move through. Example of some spear phishing there.
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on these examples already, but really it is that idea. It's not just the broad-based your FedEx package was lost. It is the very specific, the controller of an organization sends or appears to send a real specific email to somebody else, to a client, and gives payment instructions to that client. Or I've heard of an incident recently where a customer of a client, a customer of theirs, had in theory sent an email changing the bank routing information for their payment, very large payment. And so the AP department processed the change of the bank routing information, sent it along, and that went to the hacker, went to the phish. So it's these really specific, instead of the broad-based, everybody gets the same email. It's that real specific, I know enough about you to trick somebody into thinking I'm you.
And this is sort of off the topic a little bit, but just look at that slide there, the blue, www.itservice.com and www.itservices.com. You have to get your employees thinking and looking at those and to tell right away there's a difference. You got to get your employees to look at where the email is coming from, the domain name, which we the itservice.com, and it's tough, and it's got to be a continual thing every month, quarter, annually. And again, you got to figure out what your audience is and go from there.
So we're going to move to our next polling question now, which is as follows. How confident are you that your employees would identify a reasonably well-crafted phishing email and not fall victim? And so will you take a minute to answer that question and log your responses? Again, you need to answer all three for CPE. As we move into the next section of our presentation, talking about reducing risk, the good news is that the bad news is we have a lot to cover. The good news is that I think Dave's answered a lot of the questions already that we're going to answer coming up, so we can move through stuff fairly quickly. But some really, I hope, useful information as now we've explored what those common attacks are. Now we can really enter that phase of how can you protect against them. So hopefully there's some value to come here for you. So with that, I want to close the poll and see what our responses were. And the answers are 54% of our participants are somewhat confident that their employees would identify a reasonably well-crafted phishing email. That is fantastic. Very confident. I think it's wonderful to see 15%. And a couple folks out there are pretty sure people are clicking the link. That really gets back to, and we'll talk about it here over the next few minutes, the idea of how you educate your employees. And really Dave's point of how do you train them to find those keys in an email? Is that S at the end of a vendor's name that shouldn't be there? Is there something in the middle of the vendor's name that is a exclamation point instead of an L? How do you train people to look for that? Because the more training and testing you do, you'll move from moderately concerned to very confident, and that's a good thing.
I'm assuming all those very confident are the organizations out there with one person.
Or McConley and Asbury.
No, I would say somewhat confident. I mean, you're always going to have some kind of issue, so just be careful if you're overconfident.
Yes, yeah, overconfidence is bad. So we're going to move into, as I said, the next section on really how to reduce the risk. And again, there's no such thing as elimination, but we want to talk about a few things that from a executive perspective, you should be and can be thinking about to mitigate the risk. We're going to talk about tone at the top and how you send the right message. We're going to talk about infrastructure and IT measures, although we're going to keep that part very brief. And we're going to keep it brief because there's the intent of this, as we started off with, is to speak to a very high level what to think about. And really that section of slides is to identify some areas we think are important that you should discuss with your IT vendor or your IT manager or your IT department, not necessarily that we're going to give you all the answers through here. Then we're going to talk about people. The biggest risk. We're going to talk about people. And as we have time, we'll talk real briefly and let Dave tell me why I'm wrong about insurance and risk transfer. So let's talk about tone at the top. And I would say very succinctly, the idea of cybersecurity being a significant risk to every organization should be in the top 5 of every board or CEO's list. Every entity needs to consider this as one of their most significant organizational threats. So that doesn't mean you have all the answers. It doesn't mean you have somebody on the board or in that CEO seat who is a cybersecurity expert. What it means is you're addressing the fact that it is one of your most significant threats, and you're analyzing on a regular basis how your organization is responding to it. Dave talked a little bit about event response plan. I think having a cybersecurity risk management plan that is regularly reviewed, that talks about how you are going to address cybersecurity threats in your organization, and then how you will respond when there is an event or an incident, is a critical part of it. That comes out of an organization putting cybersecurity risk as one of the top 5 most significant things in their organization. You have to have a significant, or you have to have an individual who's identified as the owner of the cybersecurity risk management plan and process. And as we talked about the difference between cybersecurity risk or cyber risk and IT risk, don't automatically assume that your IT guy is also the best suited to be your cybersecurity guy. It might be a different person. We're not going to get into GDPR or what's going on in New York and other states. That's on here really just to point out that as we think about where risk is, there's a lot of regulation that's coming into play and has already come into play that is making you do things that we probably should have thought about anyway from a risk perspective, but you need to be aware of what regulation is going to drive you to change your behavior in this area as well. Final thing and most important thing from a tone of the top perspective is you cannot mitigate the risk that is coming from cyber threats and do it for free. This is an investment. Lot of gut reaction to seeing the cost involved with a highly developed cybersecurity risk management program is, wow, that's expensive. That costs too much. I can't afford that. Reality is the risk of not doing those things is so much greater that you have to look at it as an investment in your organization, an investment in the health of your organization, and not as an expense that's just taking away from net income. So, this kind of gets to that idea of who is the person that needs to own this. And reality is we've often put the idea of risk management, cybersecurity risk management, we put it in the IT department and we say it's a support service. And the mindset, in my opinion, the mindset needs to shift to where cybersecurity risk management is not a support role in an organization. It is a critical role, and it deserves a seat at the executive table in the organization. Not necessarily meaning it's a C-level executive in that role, but it means they have to have a voice to that board table and the C-suite.
Infrastructure and IT measures. I've been told I've got 30 seconds on the next 6 slides.
A little more than that.
So, we have to have the right tools in place. You have to have the right antivirus. We have to have firewalls. We have to have that stuff. Again, you can have all that stuff and have employees that click on things, etc., and you're done. So we do have to have the right tools in place. The SIM there, gets all the logs from everything, your workstations, your servers, your firewalls, and it correlates all that data and tells you what's going on. Very important. A lot of organizations don't have that, but as you grow, that's going to be one thing that you want to do.
And I think a thing we have to think about with a SIM is a lot of organizations do have it, but don't pay attention to what it does for them. And so this idea, as Dave talked about earlier, of controls, there's a vast difference between processes and things we do and controls that are in place to manage our risk. And I think a SIM's one of those great things that is a fantastic control if we pay attention to what it's telling us and work through what we're seeing. But sometimes we plug things in and assume that they're actually going to mitigate our risk when they're telling us there's all sorts of red flags we need to be paying attention to.
Correct. A SIM's not going to help you at all unless you look at it. It's not going to prevent anything. It's not going to do anything.
So don't ask if you have a SIM. Don't ask your IT guy if you have one. Ask what we're doing with the data.
Correct. And a lot of those SIMs can do vulnerability scans. So are you doing those weekly, quarterly? You should be taking care of all those critical and high vulnerabilities now. You'll see hundreds of medium, but anyway, you got to focus. You have to start somewhere. Again, implement strong user authentication, dual factor. Have it on everything. If you don't have it, that's phishing and dual factor is what you need to do right now. And again, update and patch your software constantly. The patches are annoying, but mostly the patches that come out are from a security standpoint. Someone got breached, there is an incident or vulnerability. Put that patch on before most people know about it, the vulnerability that is. Establish strong physical security procedures. It's pretty normal. Wi-Fi, if you can, don't have your guest Wi-Fi on the same network as your regular network. It makes no sense. Why would you do that? You're letting them in the door, and you can get a cheap, connection and have it totally separate. Backup procedures, test them so you can recover. Know your vendors. Are you obtaining a SOC report from them? Know who their subcontractors are. Is everything going on in this country? Working in other countries not bad, but I want to know about it. I want to know where my data is. I have a right. I'm paying a lot of money. I want to know where that data is. Do their subcontractors have the controls in place? Do they have a SOC? All those different things your security guy should be handling. And then first thing, we talked about frameworks real quick. And if you don't have any kind of framework, look at the CIS controls or the SANS top 20. Same thing, but the first thing on their list is know the hardware that you have to protect. If you don't know what you're protecting, how do you protect it? I don't know where you even start. So again, know what you need to protect. Update IT policies, employee manuals regularly. I don't know how many times I've gone to organizations and, oh yeah, we got that manual. We did that 6 years ago. These things need to be done annually and signed off annually and need to be reviewed. And again, consult with an expert. Nothing wrong with consulting with someone in regards to firewall expertise or SOC expertise or anything like that. But a lot of times your regular IT guy is not going to have the expertise to do all that stuff.
I think on that first one, I'll give you more than 30 seconds on that, Dave. I think that is the most critical thing from an organizational perspective that I think we don't always think about, right? To your point, do we know what we have out there? But not just do we know what all we're holding and where it is, but what could go wrong if that were subject to breach? I think that risk assessment process is one that's underdone and underappreciated. So I would make sure, if nothing else, we're also, and dual factor and phishing and all the other things Dave tells us have to do. I would really invest some time in that idea of knowing what's at risk.
Yeah, you're depending on how high risk, moderate, or whatever that is where you're going to put your efforts. So you're exactly right. I agree.
So, and I honestly didn't write this cartoon. I didn't draw it. I wouldn't be capable anyway. But the idea that we talk about all these hardware related things that we can do, and we can have the best environment and the best processes and controls in the world. And reality is, in the other corner, we have Dave. And I didn't pick the name, that was already on it, but we have Dave. I'd like to think our Dave's in the other corner. But reality is the human element is that which we have the least control over, and therefore we have the most risk surrounding. So let's talk for a couple minutes about how we address that. 95% of breaches are due to human error. Organizations have absolutely sound policies, procedures, internal controls, IT infrastructure. They have things in place they should have in place. But the error doesn't come because there's a hacker who can find their way in easily because the IT department did something poorly. The breach comes because someone made a mistake. And that's the vast majority. So how do you get around that? Dave has talked multiple times about security awareness training. Absolutely critical that you cover a lot of these key things we've talked about in security awareness training. What should people look for? How do they look for it? How do we make sure they're aware of the situation they're in? How do they know when now they're in a remote work environment or they're working from a coffee shop? Have we trained them as to what the risk is from working at a coffee shop? And have we given them the tools to mitigate that risk? Have we continually reinforced these things? Because security training on the day you're hired is not sufficient. And annually is probably not sufficient if it's not supplemented with multiple reminders throughout the year. Dave talked a lot about consequences already, so I won't get into that. But expectations and consequences in your policy are critical, and your employees need to understand those and agree with them. the idea of a reporting mechanism and tools for your team to comply, and that's something to the effect of a plug-in to your email server that is a fish alert, where if somebody sees something that is absolutely just maybe it's either obvious, let's just delete it, but it looks like it might be legit. It looks like it might be a real email from Dave telling me I need to reset my password, and so click here, but it kind of looks right. I need an opportunity to quickly send that through a vetting process, and that fish alert is a good way to do that. So think about something like that. And as Dave has said at least 6 times in the last 45 minutes, you have to test your employees, because when they fail, and they will fail when you start doing this, they're failing in a safe environment. When you go through the path of heavy intentional phishing and you send out the emails and they're targeted and they look too good to be true and you catch people, it's embarrassing for those individuals. It's demoralizing for the IT department because they thought things were good and they realized the human element is not where it needs to be. But over the course of a few weeks, months, and years of that constant intentional testing, you will phase out the careless clicking from your culture. It will never go away, but you will get people thinking about, is that S or the exclamation point in the IT address, or should I click on this attachment? Or is Mike Hoffner really asking me to go buy $500 worth of Apple gift cards, but he can't talk to me because he's out fishing in the river somewhere?
Just to mention this real quick with the fish alarm button, the employee will click on that and it will go to the IT department to figure out, I don't know how many times clients have had their emails compromised and sent all over their contacts, and multiple people at McConnelly and Asbury get that email and then they get fish alarmed, and we're able to alert all staff immediately that that's an issue. It's a legit email, but it's not a legit voice. It's been taken over. So it's a useful tool and should be used.
Yeah, and on that idea of training, I just want to reinforce. I believe well, I'll talk about it while we do the polling question. Go ahead and put the polling question up. So we'll go to our last polling question, which in Dave's honor, we're talking about feelings. So at this point in the presentation, are you more confident that your organization's good because you heard nothing here that bothered you? Do you realize there's work to be done? Have you determined that you're not going to sleep tonight because there's such a big issue in your organization? Or have you just decided, I'm done, I give up, I'm throwing out my phone, I'm turning off my computer, and I am heading out into the wilderness, I'm done? So folks, answer that question. I just want to talk about the onus on the employer to be clear with employees. And I'll use this as an example. And I mentioned that comment about I'm in the river, I can't talk, but I've asked Dave to go buy $500 worth of gift cards, scratch the code off the back and send it to me because I want to send them to a client, right? So an employee does that. If Dave does that, Dave goes and buys $500 worth of gift cards and sends them to the hacker. It's fraudulent, right? Whose responsibility is that? Do I have to reimburse Dave for putting those on his credit card? Or is that Dave's responsibility for not being terribly aware of what was going on? And I would say the way you answer that question is to look at how you've trained and reinforced what the right answer is. Now, if we have spent as an organization the last 3 years talking intentionally about these kinds of phishing scams or these kinds of schemes, and we've talked about how to identify these kinds of things, and we've talked about how to watch for them, and we've put in our employee manual that you have to do these things and you get trained, and Dave still sends $500 worth of gift cards, I think as an employer, I can look at Dave and say, you made a horrible mistake, but I have given you all the tools necessary to have prevented it. So I'm not reimbursing it. Where if I haven't done anything and Dave made that mistake under the true belief that it was me asking him to do that, then I'm probably on the hook to reimburse Dave. Now, organizationally, you can do whatever you want, but I think the training and the teaching and the reinforcement is the way that you take ownership of whether it's your employee's fault or the employer's fault.
And I think the more mature an organization gets with the security awareness training, you'll find that through their policies. So you'll see in the policy whether that is the organization's or the employee's issue in regards to reimbursement.
Good. So let's wrap up with just a couple of key points here as we're hitting the 3 o'clock hour. So most of you are either slightly confident or realize there's work to do, and one or two you're going off grid. So it's been nice knowing you. Make sure you get your CPE certificate before you turn your computer off and throw it in the river.
Again, we've talked about this. I'm not going to go through it anymore. We're out of time, but the human element is huge. We need to address it. Why train? You know, the human is by far the weakest link.
Oh, here we are. Wow, that was quick. Yeah, so Dave's summary of those last 2 slides is train more, and then train some more after that, and then hold people accountable for when they don't follow what you're supposed to do.
Exactly.
So let's real briefly about risk transfer and insurance. So first question is, should you have cyber risk insurance?
Yes.
And the second question is, do you, right? So some folks don't know they have it. Sometimes there's a line in our general liability insurance that gives us $5,000 of coverage for cyber risk. Dave, is $5,000 enough in your general liability policy? No. So if you believe that you have cyber liability insurance because you have it baked into your general liability, I would tell you you need to look real closely at that policy, because it's likely a throw-in they did, but it won't cover the first hour of cost you're going to incur to try and recover. So if you do have a policy, you need to understand exactly what's covered in it. You need to go through the details of it, know why everything's covered. You need to know, more importantly, what's excluded. There are things spelled out in those policies that will say this, that, and the other thing are not covered. And you need to be aware of that so that if you need to buy supplemental insurance, you can. So let's talk about the why to buy it. Dave just said, yeah, you should buy it. But don't buy it because Dave said it. Buy it because you've taken a real legitimate look at what your risk is, what the potential harm to the organization is, and if through that process you believe that you should have some insurance coverage because you have some significant exposure, then I would absolutely say go buy it. But don't do it just because we said to, although we do think it's a good idea. The one thing I want to be clear on, though, when we talk about risk transfer and the idea of insurance, buying insurance in any area is not a substitute for making the right decisions on minimizing the risk. You can buy insurance. It is not going to protect your organization from failing if you fall victim to attack after attack. You have to do all the other things right. You have to do them well. Insurance is a safety net. Anything to add? You wanted to yell at me earlier.
One thing just to add is, these can be denied very quickly if the stuff they expect of you, whether it's virus software, security awareness training, is not done. So you have to make sure that a lot of times with these policies, you get a spreadsheet and they ask you, what are you doing? If you say yes, 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 you better be doing those, because when that happens and they come back and say, we want to see this policy, we want to see how this is working. If it isn't working, well, you just made a donation to your insurance company.
That's a great way to put it. So with that, since we are just past the 3 o'clock hour, wanted to thank you for joining us for the hour. Looking at the couple of questions that were posed over the course of the webinar, couple of relevant questions were posed, and thank you for those. One was related to blockchain and how that fits into things. I'm not sure we really have time to explore what blockchain can do from a risk perspective. Blockchain is a fantastic technology, very much emerging in a number of areas, and I think is a great way to minimize risk. But that's probably another whole seminar that we could talk about. Some other conversation or question about Treasury Department fines regarding if you pay ransomware and if money goes to a sanctioned country. I think that's a little outside the scope of what we're getting into today, but it's absolutely do a Google search and you'll find some information on that. I think something to be aware of, but when you talk to your attorney about the ransomware demand you just had, your attorney will help you navigate through that particular component. So With that, appreciate your attendance, and thank you for the questions that came in. I do want to take a moment to again offer an invitation. If there's anything that Dave or his team or I or others at McConnelly and Asbury can do, we do a number of IT and cybersecurity risk evaluations. There's a lot of things in this space we can do to advise, although we also recognize there's a lot of things that take unique specialty that we don't do. So our goal is to help you find out where you need to be better in a more mature environment, and we'd love the opportunity to help you with that. So feel free to reach out to the contact information on the screen. And on behalf of Dave, thank you for joining the webinar. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to either one of us. We'll be happy to circle back with you. A recap of the presentation will be posted to McConnelly and Asbury's website in a few days. And for those who are after CPE and answered all three of our questions, those certificates you're looking for will be sent out within the next few weeks. So keep an eye out for those. So again, thank you for joining us. Have a fantastic remainder of your week, and keep an eye on your cybersecurity risk position in your organization.